not worship me, worship my actions.
¡Es ella!
¡Sí! ¡Raptora!
Oh, please, you flatter me. Por los niños, por los niños. I'm just here for the children.
Every hero needs a villain, every protagonist a foil, and more often than not, especially in this modern age, villains are becoming more sympathetic and more relatable. Sometimes we look at a villain's motivations and think, honestly, they kind of had a point. Look at Thanos, Syndrome, and Roy Batty. Though they all perform some truly evil actions, look at Thanos, he literally kills half of everything, we can see the reasons in their actions and we grow to sort of like them as characters. But sometimes a character is so vile, so unlikable that entire communities grow to despise them at their core being. I'm talking, of course, about the one, the only, Peggy Hill. But what goes into making a character as unlikable as Peggy? Well, let's get into that and talk about what makes a character unlikable and just why Peggy might be the best written character in the entirety of King of the Hill. And of course, consider this your official spoiler warning for King of the Hill, but I feel like that should be pretty obvious. And hey, while we're here, comment down below what you'd like to hear me talk about next. It definitely helps the algorithm not hate my channel. Now, I'm not saying Peggy Hill is a villain. She's an incredibly unlikable character, but she isn't really an evil person. Quite the opposite for the most part, and to be honest, a show like King of the Hill really couldn't have a definitive villain. At least in the traditional sense. This is because of the various ogre-like onion layers that all the characters are built with. Just about every character that you want to outright hate has some redeeming qualities. This great writing creates a rotating cast for different stories where someone can be a protagonist one episode and the antagonist the next. But Peggy walks this weird line where even when she's the protagonist, she has a sort of unlikability about her that many of the characters don't have. But that's a completely intentional thing, and that's a big part of who and what her character is supposed to be. But what are some of the traits that made Peggy so detestable? Well, there's definitely quite a few. The biggest one that I'll focus on is something that's sometimes referred to as small name, big ego, which is typically a character having an overinflated image of themselves. And oh man, does that sound like Peggy. Let's go over a few examples. For most of the series, Peggy is a substitute teacher. And a quick side note, while she claims to have won 3 Substitute Teacher of the Year awards, it's actually an award that she made up herself. But anyway, she fills in as a substitute Spanish teacher on a few occasions, despite the fact that she really doesn't speak Spanish. But whether it's stupidity or just a level of cockiness that would make Vegeta blush, Peggy has actually convinced herself that she speaks fluent Spanish. This comes to a head in Season 6 episode Lupe's Revenge. In this episode, Peggy goes with Bobby's class as a chaperone on their class trip to Mexico. During this trip, Peggy, due to her inability to speak Spanish, mistakenly forces a young Mexican girl to get onto the school bus and inadvertently kidnaps the girl, taking her back to the US. Peggy eventually figures out that she accidentally committed a pretty dark crime and does the responsible thing. She smuggles the child back into Mexico and is eventually arrested and put on trial. But here's where things really kick into next gear. Peggy's appointed lawyer comes up with a genius strategy: tell the truth. Peggy just needs to admit in front of a bunch of people that she really doesn't speak Spanish and that she kidnapped the girl because she didn't understand what she was saying. But weirdly, Peggy actually refuses to do this, claiming that she speaks perfect Spanish. Peggy is so cocky, so arrogant, so egotistical, that she's actually willing to go to prison before admitting that maybe she isn't quite as good at something as she's implied. This is a recurring theme with Peggy, and it's something that the writers can and do take advantage of quite regularly. And that's a big part of what makes her such a well-written character. The ability to take a piece of Peggy's interesting character, turn it up to 11, and sort of let her run wild for part of an episode. Occasionally they'll do this with other characters such as Dale or Bill, but rarely are their actions as realized as Peggy's. And in fact, Peggy is often paired up with Bill in many episodes where she routinely kind of takes advantage of him. These are two characters who work together really well, who, at least at face value, you might not expect them to. They have a weird dynamic that's unlike almost any other character dynamic in the show. In the episode Bill of Sales, Peggy works Bill so hard when the two of them are in a pyramid scheme that his feet literally start bleeding. Bill's desire to just please someone and Peggy's uncanny ability to push someone beyond their limits typically creates entertaining situations where, honestly, there probably shouldn't be one. In all honesty, it seems that Peggy has some form of narcissistic personality disorder. which can be characterized as, quote, a long-standing pattern of grandiosity, either in fantasy or actual behavior, an overwhelming need for admiration, and usually a complete lack of empathy towards others. Aside from the complete lack of empathy, this matches Peggy pretty dang well. Though to be fair, Peggy shows a pretty solid lack of empathy on more than one occasion, including the episode we talked about where she kidnaps a child, and the season 10 episode where Peggy agrees to tutor Lucky when he's trying to get his GED, but decides to send him up to fail instead. And it speaks a lot to the writing of the character that Peggy is able to do such reprehensible acts with everything still seemingly fitting into her character incredibly well. But while Peggy has time and again done a lot of just terrible things, it's not as though she isn't without her moments of compassion. She obviously loves her family and wants the best for them. In fact, it's fair to say that most positive attributes that we see in Bobby are more from Peggy than they are from Hank. And typically, she pushes Hank to accept Bobby as he is, not as Hank wants him to be. She also really only tricked Lucky into failing his GED test because she thought that Luann, her niece, deserved better. She's willing to go through great lengths for her family, but that doesn't always excuse her actions. Now, is there any definitive proof that people are actually disliking Peggy? Well, yeah. Aside from a ton of threads you can find with a quick Google, I actually ran a poll right here on my own YouTube channel. I asked the question, who is your least favorite character in King of the Hill and why? And, well, the results were incredibly one-sided. With almost 9,000 votes, Peggy got 81%. Looking at the comments, it seems a lot of people's biggest problem with Peggy is that she never really seems to learn anything from her generally terrible actions. But to be fair, most characters don't in an episodic format. For the most part, if a character does learn something, it tends to be more of two or more characters reaching middle grounds, rather than someone having a complete change of heart. And since this isn't an ongoing story, characters generally reset with little to no consequences aside from one or two instances. Though I think that this hatred is still kind of undeserved. Peggy annoys because she's written to annoy. She infuriates because they want her to get under your skin. It's very similar to Skylar from Breaking Bad. She's yet another character who's pretty unanimously hated amongst a huge portion of the show's fans. But in reality, it's only because of the brilliant writing of these shows that we are able to identify with some characters and feel such disdain for others. The more successful the villain, the more successful the picture. And with as hated as Peggy seems to be, it's no surprise King of the Hill was viewed with such reverence when looking back on it. The writers took great care when sculpting the show's core characters, and you can see this in all the ways that these different characters interact with each other. And this might just be most apparent in Peggy Hill, the most hated character in King of the Hill. But anyways, this has been 10K Bill, and thanks for watching. Comment down below what you'd like to hear me talk about next. Follow me on Twitter at 10K Bill, support us on our Patreon, and of course, make sure you subscribe for all your entertainment-related content.